Auzubillah min shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the first online AMSA Ask Murabbi. Jazakallah for everyone who's tuned in to watch this, and Jazakallah to our panel of Murabbiyan today as well. So on our panel today we have Mustafa Siddiqui Saab, who is a 6-year student at Jamia, and we also have Tariq Khalid Saab, who is Murabbi Silsila for Baitul Hasan region. So just to cover the theme again, the theme of today's Ask a Murabbi is how to improve yourself. As I'm sure many of the students watching today know, universities have closed due to the coronavirus, and a lot of students have much more free time on their hands than they would have done otherwise. And the purpose of this talk is to sort of see how students can maximize this free time so that they can get the most benefit out of it. And if you have any questions that you want to ask, there's a link in the description that will take you to a Google form that you can ask questions on. We already have quite a nice selection of questions for you today as well, which we'll start with. And if we have time, we'll also cover any questions that come in during the talk as well. So moving to our panel, Khair, if I can start with yourself and just ask you to give a few thoughts on how Khuddam can maximize this time that they have and how they can use it to improve themselves.
Auzubillahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We know around the world this pandemic is creating a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of problems. Families are scared of going out, and of course, with the lockdown, many members are scared of what will happen if they go out. If they have to go out for essentials, like in the UK, you can still go out for essentials and work, of course. So there's always a fear of being able to contract this. Nevertheless, in this time when most of us are working from home, most of us have been told to stay at home, and the restrictions which have been placed upon us, the best thing for us as Ahmadi Muslims in particular, regardless of what our profession is, whether we are working in any field, we should spend as much time as we can. Although that time which we would spend in traveling, that time we spend going out and doing certain things, we can't do that. That's that time which we're talking about now is what we can do to utilize that time the most, to make it as productive as possible. As Khuddam, as members of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, the best thing we can do is to follow the advice given by Khalifatul Masih. And Khalifatul Masih has told us for many, many years, actually, to try to become a better person. Try to build on your weaknesses, turn them into strengths. And in this time, the best thing which we can do is to self-evaluate. Evaluate and see where our faults are. Ask yourself every night before going to sleep, how much time have I spent wasting my time? How much time have I spent doing something good? And if you see your faults, then you can see, okay, tomorrow I'm not going to make the same mistake. And we start with the first thing, Fajr. I want to read my Fajr on time. When you start your day with Fajr, when you start your day with the worship of God, then the rest of your day will, inshallah, be as successful and very blessed, because you start the day with the right thing. You start the day with the worship of God. And then, as Hazur has mentioned, we should always be, after every prayer in the morning, after Fajr prayer, in the morning particularly, we should be reciting the Holy Quran. So these are just things which, of course, we're going to move on to practical things which we can be doing during the day. But worship of God, it has to start. We have to be practical. We have to be productive. We have to evaluate ourselves, how we can try to be make the most of our day.
Jazakallah for that, Farsab. If I can just quickly come back to one point that you mentioned, the point of waking up for Fajr and how, having that start to your day can make a big impact on, the quality of your day. I'm sure, a lot of other Khuddam listening today feel that as well. But in terms of actually, managing to wake up for Fajr, often many students say, I have the sort of want to wake up for Fajr, but I find it very difficult. What are some steps that students can take to actually make sure that, they do wake up on time?
So the first thing, which from my own personal experience, which I can tell, is that and the Quran says it as well, that man has been created weak. We are full of weaknesses, and we have to try and, again, like Azul has said, we have to evaluate. We have to see what we're doing wrong. And when you see, if you think of how, let's say, for example, if you miss today's Fajr, then you think, and you have that regret in your heart, that remorse that, oh yeah, I missed my Fajr, I shouldn't have missed it. And you think, what was the reason behind it? Maybe my intention wasn't pure. Maybe my niyat wasn't 100%. This is the thing. If your niyat, if your intention, if your motive is 100%, whatever happens, I'm going to read my Fajr on time. Then, even if you sleep at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., you wake up in an hour. You wake up on time for Fajr. So your intention has to be pure. Your intention has to be right. Even if you're 98% that you want to read, and that 2% is in your heart and your mind, that, okay, I'll wake up, but will I wake up on time? I don't know. That thing, that doubt that you put in yourself, that will ultimately can lead to you missing your Fajr. And from then on, your whole day will become, if you have that remorse, if you feel that I've done something wrong, if your conscience is telling you you've done something wrong, then your day can't be as successful as you want it. For that, you have to do istighfar. So there's two steps, two things that we should be doing. One, have a good niyat, have a good intention, a strong intention that come what may, I will wake up for Fajr and I will offer my prayers on time. And secondly, we should be doing istighfar. Istighfar, as the Prophet ﷺ has told us, is for two things. One, to cover our weaknesses. Fajr, being not offering Fajr on time, is a weakness. One, to cover your weakness, and secondly, that it covers the faults and it gives you the strength to not commit this fault again. So if you're doing istighfar, that I've missed my Fajr, and you're asking for forgiveness, within that prayer, it is giving you that strength to not allow you to make that mistake again. So these are just two things, simple. There's many more things we can talk about, but we're going to put some links up as well, that if you do want to see some further things on this topic, then of course we'll inshallah put some stuff up. But these two main things, have a pure intention, and secondly, istighfar will give you that strength to ask forgiveness and the strength to wake up the next day.
Jazakallah, Murabbi. Mustafa Sahib, if I can now come to yourself, if you could also just give us, a few thoughts on how we can use this time to improve ourselves, and how, students in particular, with the 24 hours a day now that we have free, since we don't have to go to university, how we can maximize that time to get the most out of it. If I can come to you on that.
So there's two things here. I think Daya Saab's answer was very complete and very, very eloquent. But if I could add two matters of principle, which is, for example, the first being in Quran, that at the end of Surah Al-Inshirah, in the 30th part, God says, وَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ فَانْصَبْ, that when you're free, when you find free time, when you're free of responsibilities, work harder. And in the next verse, وَإِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَارْغَب, and incline towards your Lord. That Quran teaches us basically that when life throws lemons at you, make lemonade, which is basically availing yourself of opportunities. And when you find free time, seeing that as an opportunity to work harder to find your matters of principle. So seeing free time as an opportunity for you to do the other things that you left out as compared to what you were doing before, as a matter of principle. Secondly, so this lockdown provides us with that kind of opportunity to work harder than we otherwise were, because we're not shackled by the same responsibilities of our daily routine. The second thing is that people nowadays are complaining about isolation being the death of our social lives, and we can't go out, we can't see our friends, we can't do the things we used to. But I'd argue that no way of life or no religion is more social than Islam. Islam is the only religion which makes compulsory 5 rights, for example, like saying salam to everyone you see, whether you know them or not, visiting the sick, following funerals, accepting invitations, and even to the point of saying, may Allah have mercy on you, as in there's a reply, and then another reply to someone who sneezes. Islam is that social. But the rights of the people, and Islam is split between the rights of the people and the right of God. So if we can't go out and fulfill the rights of the people right now, there's a whole other half of Islam, which is the rights of God Almighty. And this, if isolation is seen like a scary word, but it's important to remember that the Prophet ﷺ spent many, many years of his youth and his life in isolation, and he found God in isolation. So this isolation that we have actually presents us with a massive opportunity where all of a sudden we're not We're not in that rat race anymore. We're not going out, going to college, coming back, lectures, in and out. We're suddenly at home. And we could make our home like the cave of Hira, where the Prophet ﷺ, hours in isolation, found God Almighty. And what happened in that cave and then what ensued changed the course of the world. So when the Quran says, فَإِذَا وَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ فَانْصَبْ, when you're free, strive harder, is basically Islam predating when life throws lemons at you, make lemonade. I've also read another saying that an idle mind is the playground of Satan, because that gives you time to worry about, oh no, I'm stuck at home, I can't go out. Whereas I think people who are more successful, and MD should try to be the pinnacle of those people, are those who make make the best of the opportunities that they have and whatever life throws at them.
One of the questions that we've had that's come in, and I think links quite nicely to what you've just been talking about, is that in general, and especially during this time, how can students and anyone in general tackle loneliness?
That's a very good question. Well, again, bringing it back to the Holy Quran, I think, for example, with alcohol and with gambling, the Quran does say that there are benefits in them, though their negatives or their disadvantages outweighs their benefits. So what the Quran teaches us there is that nothing in itself is bad or good. Everything is weighed according to the relative comparison between its good and bad. So while loneliness has a negative aspect, technology is something, especially as MDs, we are right to be wary of, because there's lots of negatives. But a believer is someone who uses everything that God has given him, sees it as a blessing and takes the best out of it. So what we can do is, with technology, is we can use that to develop relationships and link with people who we couldn't otherwise meet. And isolation perhaps is now more of an opportunity in this age than it ever was before. Because from within our homes, the amount of people we can contact, the amount of good we can do just from sat in our homes, is the way an MD would be thinking. Whereas otherwise, I've seen articles like the list of the top 10 Netflix shows you must watch to occupy yourself during lockdown. So it's all a mentality thing. And so now more than ever before, we can stay in contact with our family members. And that personal relationship isn't there, that physical proximity isn't there. But then at the same time, it does provide us with a greater chance for proximity towards God Almighty. It says in the Holy Quran, is it not by the remembrance of God that hearts find comfort?
Jazakallah. And perhaps if I can just come to you now. Mustafa Saab mentioned, the use of social media and how, we can use it to our benefit in the current climate. Just on that, a lot of students also feel that through things like social media, YouTube, and Netflix, that they end up spending a lot of time procrastinating and a lot of time, that they just are wasting that they could have otherwise used, productively. How can students and how can people in general sort of counteract the need to procrastinate and the need and this sort of inbuilt thing that we have to waste time? What can we do to sort of avoid that?
It's a very good question, and I think it will be in the mind of many people of what we can be doing and what's the best thing that we can do to utilize our time. And a lot of people will turn to social media. A lot of people will be turning to their games, to social media, to Netflix, and to just spending their time watching TV. I want to tell you an incident of a Murabbi. He went to Khalifatul Masih, Idar Talab Nasrizi. He went to Hazur and he spoke about what's the best thing we can do to actually utilize our time. And Hazur said to him, look, you have to think of every day with each minute. Think of each minute of each hour. One day you have 24 hours. Let's say you sleep for 6 hours, 6 to 8 hours, yeah? Whether that is then 16 hours or 18 hours, 6 to 8 hours. Let's say you sleep for 8 hours. That's 16 hours left of your day in which you can use. You've had a good 8 hours sleep. You've got 16 hours. What's the most you can do? Now, prayer will probably take up an hour and a half. All 5 prayers will probably take up an hour and a half of your whole day. 15 hours left. You have, let's say you want to eat. Let's say each meal 3 times a day will probably take 20 minutes. That's another hour. Yeah. So what you have 14 hours left. Then let's say you want to spend time with your family. How long? 2, 3, 4 hours. Let's say 3 hours. You have 11 hours left. 11 hours left of your day. You can do so much if you spend those 11 hours. And who knows? A lot of us, when we're eating, we're probably watching TV at the same time. But even after you're eating, you've spent time with your family, whether it's spending time with your family means you're watching TV with your family. With the 11 hours left, if you're still doing the same thing of just going on social media, watching films, watching TV, playing games, this is procrastination. This is wasting your time. And this is something which can be very harmful, very detrimental to our health, and also to our mindset, to our mental well-being as well. It is important for us. It's imperative for us that we spend that time wisely, be productive. If we're spending that hour on social media, for example, just now, even if you go into social media, you see that there's a lot of fear-mongering in there. People everywhere, they're talking about COVID-19, the coronavirus. People are dying left, right, and center. The more you go into social media, the more you read about these things, the more panic it builds inside you. Then you spread these messages onto your family, or someone in your family is spreading the message onto you. The best thing you can do, turn your notifications off. Try and spend as less time as possible to stay away from this. And if you want to, spend 1 hour, 2 hours max. But then you still have 9 hours. If you spend 2 hours on social media, on your Twitter, on your Instagram, on your Facebook, you still have 9 hours. But time flies when you're not, when you know that you're involved in something which you're just consumed in something. You don't know where the time is going. So we have to remember there's so many things that we can do to spend our time wisely. You can go out with your family, and with the restrictions that are in place, you can go out with your own family. You can't be in contact with other people within the distance, but you can be in contact with your own family. Go out. If you have siblings, go and play in the park. Go to your garden. Do productive things. Go out and try and do some activities within the confinements of your own home, or within the confinements of where you are allowed to be. Spend time reading books. There's so much time that we have now to read the books of the Promised Messiah, read the books of the community. If you don't have the physical time to actually do that, or because your hands are busy with something else, you don't have the time to flip through the pages, you can have audiobooks. We're blessed in the community that we have audiobooks in Al-Islam. You can actually listen to the books of the Promised Messiah whilst doing the chores around the house. Even yesterday, I was doing chores in my house. I had the audiobooks up and I was listening to Tazkiratul Shahadatain, which is the account of the two martyrs in the time of the Holy Prophet, the Promised Messiah. And it's amazing how we have these facilities. We have these in our reach, in our grasp, but we're not utilizing it to the best of our ability. So we should, again, like the first point I mentioned, we have to self-analyze. We have to ask ourselves before we sleep every night, how much time am I actually spending on social media? How many hours am I actually spending watching TV, watching Netflix, watching films? If I can spend that time and maybe read a book for an hour, then go out and go for a walk with my family, and come back and do something else, do another activity. There's so many things which can happen in the house. But we have to ask ourselves, if we're going to be doing something which is unproductive, then that will not bring us any benefit.
And one of the questions that we've had come through on the Google Forms, again very linked to this, is can the Murabbiyan recommend any sort of strategies we can use to manage our time? I know you've touched on it, Tahir Sahib. Mustafa Sahib, if you could just sort of give us some practical strategies that we could actually use to sort of make sure that the 12-16 hours that we have completely free in our day, that we how can we maximize those hours?
I think you should make a timetable, because procrastination is, I think everyone has it to a certain extent, thinking what to do. While you're thinking what to do, you're not actually doing anything. We'll do it anyway. You can't completely eliminate that, and you do need to consider what you do before you do it, because thinking how you act before you act is how you act correctly. But it's better to, rather than have that thinking time, what should I do next, split among the day, as in 5 minutes of thinking what to do then, and then later then think about the next thing, and then the next thing in bits. It's better to spend that time thinking at one point where you're sat somewhere. If you think on your feet, you tend not to have all of your senses around you, because you're distracted by things with the progress of the day. But if you, at the beginning of the day, ideally, or the night before, plan your day, then you can think of it, you can give everything priority at the time. Like if you're doing something at one point, it tends to take more importance because you're doing it at the time. And things which are going to come up later on in the day or later on don't tend to have so much importance because they're not in front of you. But if in the morning or at night before you started anything, everything, because nothing's happening at that time, everything tends to appear more equal, and then you're more likely to properly balance time and give priorities to what gives priority, rather than thinking in your feet during the day, because when you're thinking about different things, you're thinking about them while doing some of them, and therefore you can't, in the same way, balance your prioritization like you can by reflecting before you go to sleep or when you wake up in the morning.
Okay, Jazakallah. And I'd just like to mention to our viewers, it seems that we are having some minor audio issues. Our technical team is working to fix that. Inshallah, it shouldn't last too much longer. Just on that point, I think you mentioned the point about timetable, which is an excellent point to mention. In a recent class with Hazur, one of the students actually asked Hazur, how can we get the most out of our time? How can we, manage our time? And Hazur actually said that make a timetable, but Hazur stressed that don't make a timetable before your day starts. Make a timetable at the end of your day so you can monitor, how much time have I spent working? How much time have I spent talking to my friends? Which I thought was an excellent point that was mentioned. Another one of the questions that we've had come through is that what books would the Murabbiyan recommend? Specifically, what books of the Prophet Messiah would the Murabbiyan recommend that are easy for young people to sort of get to grips with and understand? If I can, whoever wants to cover this one.
Can I just point out Noah's Ark? A couple of, not that long ago, has especially mentioned that book. When you read some of the, what the Promised Messiah, firstly, the Promised Messiah gives the most beautiful comparison between Noah's Ark at that time, which was basically the physical fulfillment of spirituality and deliverance from the punishment of sin in terms of the flood in the ark. And the Promised Messiah says that this community that I have started here and you are members of is that ark now, which is a spiritual, essentially reincarnation or a second coming of that same ark. Whereas now, in this age, the flood is the flood of sin, the flood of immorality, the flood of what we're seeing in lockdown, which is when we're free, let's just watch things on a screen, which aren't even real. And that's how we're going to fulfill our day, which is rather than having Netflix as something to do when you're free, your life is for Netflix, which is not Netflix live, but live for Netflix. And I'm pretty sure everybody knows that ultimately those actors are acting and it's not real. But when that becomes the pivot of your day, you really have to be asking, what is your life worth, essentially? Which sounds quite serious, but deep down, that's what it is. In Noah's Ark, the Promised Messiah says that this community is the ark, the second coming and the fulfillment of that ark, which we first existed in the time of Noah. And then he goes through a list of moral qualities and he says that whoever doesn't do this is not part of my community. Whoever doesn't do this is not part of my community. I think if everybody did every single thing there, they'd be perfect. So ultimately, or certainly if I look, there's loads of things there that by the strict definition of the text, I am not part of the Promised Messiah community when my focus isn't on prayer or things like that. But what that does is that reminds all of us what being an Ahmadi truly is, because the amount of focus the Promised Messiah has given to morality and morals in that book and having true faith, I think that's why, one of the main reasons why Hazur emphasized it so much a couple of months ago in his sermon. So that is a really, really relevant and really hard-hitting, powerful book. And not even my recommendation, it's Hazur's recent recommendation on the basis of the times we live in right now. So that's a book I really would recommend.
And Tahajjud, if I can just come to you with the same question, are there any other books that you would recommend?
Of course, there's quite a few. Mustafa Saab has mentioned one of the many books. There are many others which are really relevant to our time as well. Of course, we know that this Noah's Ark, the book which Hazur has mentioned himself, is very powerful, very relevant for this time as well. But there are other books as well which I wanted to mention. One being The Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam, which is a book which a lot of our Khuddam must have read, and in which the Promised Messiah he discusses the physical, moral, and spiritual states of man, which he breaks down what are the reasons why man gets involved into sin, which is an amazing book. And he's explained it in so many different ways. He gives proofs of the existence of God, the state of man after death, the sources of divine knowledge, and many other things, which is an excellent introduction to the study of Islam. Some of the other books which I would really recommend, not only of the Promised Messiah, والسلام, but of the other Khulafa. There's one book known as Remembrance of Allah by Hazrat Muslim Maud. There's one book, Remembrance of Allah, is known as Zikr Ilahi, and there's another book by his brother Hazrat Mirza Bashir Ahmed MA, which is Our God. Another fantastic, a very beautifully eloquent book talking about the greatness and the grandeur of God Almighty, how we can find Him. On another level, if someone is interested in history, then we have Life of Muhammad, a book which Hazur Anwar himself has also mentioned that we should be studying, and we should be giving it out to as a means for the believer as well. The Life of Muhammad, which discusses by Hazrat Mirza Bashir Mahmud Ahmad, of course, is also being translated from Sirat Khatam al-Nabiyyin and other books as well. Then another book which talks about, one of the books which I'm also studying at this moment, The Outset of Dissension in Islam, which talks about after the Holy Prophet ﷺ, how the dissension, how the internal arguments, how the internal wars happened. And a lot of if you discuss this with Muslims, a lot of them don't even know about the internal battles which happened within the Khulafa, within the family of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. So these are things which we can learn, which will help us in our understanding of the faith, and what the Khulafa have said about them as well. Again, another book which is very important for this day as well, which is more concise, which discusses a lot of the things which we talk about in our day-to-day life as well, is this book is known as An Introduction to the Study, an introduction to the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, by Hazrat Mirza Bashir Mahmud Ahmad. Again, a very beautiful book. But again, apart from these, there's so many other books. Like I mentioned, the audiobooks which we have on Al-Islam. Yesterday I was listening to Tazkiratul Shahadatain. But there's so many other books which the members of the community have actually discussed and read out, which we can listen to in our free time. Hazuri Anwar has written books as well, which can actually benefit us in this day and age as well. We have the conditions of Bayt. As an Ahmadi Muslim, what our conditions are, what we should be doing. And this book is amazing, which has references from the Holy Quran, the Ahadith, the sayings of the Prophet Messiah. And Hazur himself has explained these conditions of Bayt and what we should be doing. Then another very important book with regards to the state of the world, and how the immense need of peace is the world crisis and the pathway to peace. We know Hazur Anwar has gone around the country, around the world, given speeches on many different issues, particularly on how we can attain peace, not only in ourselves, but in the wider society. And if we read these books, we can first find peace within ourselves, and then we can find peace within our wider society. And one thing which Mustafa mentioned as well, which I want to touch upon as well, about how we can find peace in our life, particularly in this time of this self-isolation, this lockdown. And I came across a photo which talks about growth mindset, the mindset shift from lockdown to becoming open-minded. So, for example, someone whose mind is under a lockdown state, they're thinking, I'm stuck at home, I'm going to run out of items, I cannot buy anything new, everything is shutting down, I'm panicking, there's too much insecurity, I feel anxious and unsafe. This is a mindset which a lot of people have at this moment. But we have to change this mindset. And we have to change to being an open-minded person, thinking of being that, look, number one, I'm safe, I'm at home, I'm safe, and I'm spending more time with my family. That if you're panicking about shops closing, you have to be open-minded and think, look, I've got enough at home right now. Let me use it wisely. Let me ration it. Let me see how long I can use it for, and let me reduce what reduce. Let me recycle. Let me reuse these items. then the most important things that we need in this day for our essentials, the medical stores, the medical facilities, these are still open. So we can't be panicking. We can't be in a state of thinking that if I need help, no one will be there. And that while we cannot control the situation, we can control our actions by keeping ourselves safe, thinking that we're keeping an open mind, that whatever's happening in this situation, the doctors are trying their best. But what am I doing to make the most of my time? What am I doing? Is my mindset in this place where I'm being negative? If I'm being negative, that's going to have an impact to my brothers and sisters, to the relatives that I'm talking to. That will have an impact on how your day is spent. So that's why we have to analyze, we have to think. And like Hazur Anwar, Aida Talib bin Aziz mentioned, and I want to read out a quote which Hazur said that the ultimate tool that we have at our disposal is that of prayer. We should all pray for the entire world that Allah the Almighty may save mankind from the harmful effects of this virus. Furthermore, may Allah grant health to all Ahmadi Muslims, alongside the ability to become stronger in their faith. So Hazur's told us what we should be doing in this time. We should use our time wisely and pray. Pray for, and the beautiful thing about prayer, and those who've actually felt the immense blessings of prayer, is that the more you open, for example, if you go into sajda and you start opening your heart out to God Almighty, and you start with yourself, you talk about yourself to God Almighty, then you start with your parents and your loved one, your closest. You talk about Khalifatul Masih, you're asking Allah for prayers. And the more you indulge in this, the more you get involved in this, the more your heart opens up and allows you to say prayers that you never thought of. And then you think about the wider society and you pray for everyone. And at this moment, when your heart is being opened up to prayers, that's when you find peace. That's when you find comfort. And like the Holy Prophet ﷺ said, that a true believer is one who feels anxious after one prayer to the next prayer. This happens when you really enjoy praying. And as Zul mentioned, if you want to find this pleasure in prayer, then we should ask Allah for it Himself. Say in your prayer, you should focus on Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, ihdina as-siratal mustaqim. That Allah, Thee alone do we worship and Thee alone do we pray for help. Guide us on this right path. And ask Allah to give me that pleasure of namaz. Give me that pleasure of salat. And when you find that pleasure, everything changes.
Musa Sahib, if I can now come to you with the next question. One of our brothers has asked, I want to become more practicing and religiously knowledgeable over my summer holiday and over this period. Where would you recommend that they start with this?
The best thing to do would be the books of well, it depends. More practicing and more knowledgeable are two different things. More practicing is something that's going to have to come from inside. It cannot come from anywhere else. The starkest example I can think of is the cases of Abu Bakr Siddiq, may Allah be pleased with him, and Abu Jahl. Both of them lived very, very close to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Its entire life, they witnessed his character. One became the most sincerest companion, and one became his most sworn enemy, because their hearts were different. That's not to say that someone's of a certain heart and that's how they are, but the motivation and the drive to respond to the Prophet's call from two people right next to him was so different because of who they were on the inside. So in terms of practicing, that desire has to come from within. And the way to develop that is, there's many, many, many ways. But I think one of the best things is to look at how a virus, which is tiny, invisible, has brought the most developed and powerful societies in the world to an absolute shutdown. Before, the last time we had this kind of restrictions and peacetime and talks of rationing was in World War II, when there were bombs dropping from the sky, explosions, people dying, and people being shot, and air raids, and all those things. We are now under similar kind of restrictions of not leaving the house by a tiny, 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 invisible little thing called a virus, which for me has just showed how weak and powerless we are. And those kind of things remind us that if society can be brought to its knees by a tiny, invisible little atom, what are we in comparison and in front of God Almighty? And when you think those kind of things, and this idea that we have that we are individually, that I am someone, or nationally that our society is something, our country is something, we are, we are who we are the West, we are developed, all comes crumbling down. Then you realize how small you are, and then you realize how much you need God Almighty. Just because God Almighty doesn't send us reminders every single day of how powerful He is, it would be remiss of us to forget and to miss and to forget about what we are compared to Him. In terms of study, in terms of knowledge, the Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam that Taisa mentioned is a really, really good book, because it really goes down into the philosophy of why Islam is what it is. There are a number of books. I recommend the Al-Islam English library section. There's a lot of articles there. It would be more about how to approach it. There's a lot of religious books in terms of there's like question answer section, book full of loads and loads of small pieces of information. But then on the other hand, there's the fourth Khalifa's book, Islam's Response to Contemporary Issues, which is more about answering people's objections in light of contemporary allegations in this society. So there's a lot of material. I would recommend the Al-Islam library. Or, it's not self-promotion here, but I'm on Instagram and I'm on social media. More than that, Tahir Sahib is a qualified Murabbi. I'm just a student. So Tahir Sahib and other Murabbis, there's loads of them out there. And even before Jamia, I always used to ask them my questions, and that's what inspired me to become Murabbi, because of how helpful they were. So there's loads of these Murabbiyan who sacrificed their life and whose day job is to help people. So I definitely recommend getting in touch with some of them.
Jazakallah. So the next question that we've had come through is that obviously everyone's reading Jummah in their homes at the moment. One of the brothers asked, if I'm praying Jummah at home and I'm the only male member and hence leading the Jummah, who should call the Adhan? If I can come to Tahir Sahib on that.
When you're at home, then there'll be no need to call Azan, and because they're already there, ready to offer the Jummah prayer, there'll be no need to offer the Azan. Then the guy himself, the male, will be leading the khutbah. He'll sit down and then do khutbah saniya, and lead the namaz. His family members, if it's his wife, they can give takbir, but of Azan itself, there's no need, as everyone is still ready there.
Okay, Jazakallah. Another question has come through is how do you perform Tahajjud in terms of what time should you wake up, in terms of how much time should you wake up before Fajr, and how many rakats do you need to do for Tahajjud?
So Tahajjud time will be before Azan time. In our mosques, Azan time, for example, if Azan is now, the hours went 1 hour forward last night, the Fajr time is 5:30. That means in our mosques, Azan time is actually 5:20. But the actual time for Azan is much earlier than this. I don't have the exact time right now. I'll have to check the Salat calendar to see what the exact time is, but it's much earlier. So it will probably be around 4:40 to 4:50. That will be the exact actual Azan time. From then, you can offer your Fajr. Before that, that's all Tahajjud time. And Tahajjud, we know, like the example of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, he would offer 8 rakat of Tahajjud, and then he would read his Witr prayers, so 11 in total. But this was the practice of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. Us, according to how early we wake and what our ability is, how much we're praying, we can do 2, 4, 6, or 8, even more. But this was the practice of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, to read 8, and then he would read his Witr before Azan, before the Fajr prayer.
Okay. And then moving on to the next question. The question is, how has Islam contributed to science, and what was the Islamic golden age? I'll open that to whoever wants to take it.
Awesome.
Sorry, you can you repeat the question?
So it's sort of a two-part question. It's, how has Islam contributed to science, and what was the Islamic golden age?
So it's a bit of a tricky question, in the sense of I don't have the references of all the names of the scientists and the philosophers who, at the time after the Holy Prophet ﷺ, a few hundred years later, we know that the first university was started by a Muslim woman, She started the first university. One of the first people that started the algorithm was a Muslim man, from which many of our devices that we have today, the systems that are set around the world, is through the science which was made by these first Muslim scholars. Again, the Islamic, I mean, they say traditionally around the 8th through the 14th century, it was a period of culture, economic, and scientific flourishing, where we know that the scholars around Asia, Baghdad, Afghanistan, these places there were a lot of great scholars who were born as Muslims, and they studied to excel. We know of Ibn Sina as well, very great physician, who changed the modern way of medicine. Like him, many others. But again, apologies, I don't have the actual names. We can hopefully put the links up of those scholars, those philosophers, those physicians who actually changed modern science, modern medicine to what it is now. And this was hundreds of years ago. They did their research through the guidance of the Holy Quran as well. Even in this day and age, we see that with the Nobel laureates with the likes of Abdus Salam Sahib, how it was through the Holy Quran that he found that it inspired him to do his research into his specific field of science and physics, which allowed him to become a Nobel laureate and change our understanding of the earth and of science as a whole. Again, there have been Muslims across the ages who have done similar accomplishments and achieved these things. But Muslims have, again, through the guidance of the Holy Quran, they've found inspiration within the Holy Quran to then study it and then excel in their own fields. We know of Khalifatul Masih the first, Hazrat Maulvi Hakim Nuruddin Sahib, he used to say that there's every single knowledge that you can imagine, every single subject that you can imagine is within the Holy Quran. And that knowledge, we can find that knowledge if we study its commentaries. Again, on Al-Islam, the Khulafa have written amazing commentaries. The exegesis which they've written is something which is incomparable. Particularly as a Muslim, his commentary of the Holy Quran, the grand exegesis which he has written, is something which you can find no comparison to that. And within that, he speaks about the verses which pertain to science and the field of science. He's discussed it and elaborated it in great detail. So for those who wish to see those, you can read those books. They're on Al-Islam as well.
Jazakallah.
Can I add to that, please?
Yes, of course, Mr. Sa.
Thank you. That's just well, firstly, as Taisa has mentioned, plenty of scholars, for example, Ibn Sina, who's known was Latinized as Avicenna, and Ibn Rushd as Averroes. Just giving two examples, were two polymaths, which I think means it's like scholars who at the time were of such standing that they were not specific, or they did not make groundbreaking achievements in one particular field, but like science, philosophy, mathematics, geometry, all of these things all found completion in one person. And for example, the fact that algebra, the word itself comes from a scholar called Al-Jabr in Arabic, and how all these things have science. So a lot of the principles of science and mathematics find their origin at this time. And also, if it comes to the question of Islam's contribution to science, I think you can't overlook the Quran itself being the book of God Almighty, its contribution to science. And for example, when at the beginning, or 15 verses into Surah Al-Mu'minun, it in details the process of embryology and every single stage of a fetus and how it develops and how it's I can't remember the exact verse now, but it's a lump of flesh, then it gets bones, then it's clothed by skin. And those more knowledgeable in the Ahmadiyya Muslim community than me, doctors, have told me that this contributes exactly and is in exact accordance to embryology studies that we know now, at a time when there was no way of looking inside a womb or knowing what's going on. And the fact that the Quran says a time will come, there will be a time when their skins will bear witness against them as to what they're doing, which is like extremely direct reference to fingerprints and forensics and all those kind of things. And the fact that the universe was a rolled up mass, and then we not only did we open it, which exactly is the Big Bang, but also that, and we are as expanders, which is basically now we know that the universe is still expanding, is continually expanding. So those are just like three of several scientific prophecies of the Holy Quran, which are in itself miraculous of their nature because they were revealed to a man who didn't even know how to read. So the Quran's scientific prophecies are a massive contribution of Islam to science.
Jazakallah. And Mustafa Sahib, if I can come to you with the next question as well. Someone has asked, what is the best way to learn Urdu? And I think there's referring specifically to in terms of being able to read Urdu, so that they can start to read the books of the Promised Messiah.
What you should do is, the best thing to do when I studied Arabic was get a teacher, which I understand is not the most practical advice, but it's the best I can give in the sense that any language is best taught by a native language speaker, just as a matter of principle for any languages. An Arabic teacher was quite difficult to find, but bless my mum for that. But when it comes to Urdu, I think a lot of people in our community are fluent native speakers of Urdu. A lot of us live with fluent speakers of Urdu, and I think that's sometimes a point we overlook, which is that the language of the Promised Messiah is so accessible to us, because for like my generation, it's difficult for us to read. If it wasn't for Jamia, I wouldn't be able to read the books of the Promised Messiah in Urdu. But I live with my dad and my other family. They're all native speakers of Urdu. So I think a lot of, if an MD is asking this anyway, if not in their house, definitely within their local community, they know a lot of native speakers. And that's one of the best things I could do, which is get them to help out and get them to point people towards resources. I think also it's important to read. God gave us the Quran, which is the ultimate source of learning, which is that we learn by books. There's loads of Urdu novels out there. And that would be my main advice, reading and trying to find a teacher. I know that's not very helpful, but it's difficult. It's not easy, I know.
And then, if I can come to you with the next question. Someone has asked, and I think they're referring to the coronavirus here, is this a punishment from God?
If it was a punishment from God, then the first person to tell us would be Huzur Anwar. We're so fortunate that we have Khalifatul Masih with us, who can guide us on every step of our life. This is something which is overtaking all of us, something which everyone is anxious and worried about. And people are thinking, is it a plague? Is it something which is a punishment from God? Will Ahmadis be saved? We know Ahmadis have been affected by this. Some very pious Ahmadis as well. And as we mentioned in last week's Al-Hakam, that even in 1918, I believe, when influenza was spreading around the world, Hazrat Muslim he also contracted influenza. And he had just recently become a Khalifa a few years before that. He was so severely ill that he wrote his will that in the case of my passing, this is my will. And this is something which is recorded in the history of the Jamaat. And Hazrat Anwar Aziz has mentioned that this is no such punishment as such. These things come and go. And what he said, if it was, I would have told the Jamaat first. And I've been telling the Jamaat to take precautions and start rationing for many, many years. So things like this can happen. And it's not a punishment from God. Otherwise, he mentioned that I would tell people to not even take the medicines, because it will be a sign of the truthfulness of the Jamaat. But Hazur has said nothing of this sort. And he's explained to us and he showed us that we should be taking precautions. We should follow the guidance of the government as well. And this is exactly what we're doing. If it was a punishment or if it was a sign that the Jamaat is truthful, why would we close the mosques? Why would we stop the mulaqats meeting with Hazur? Why would Hazur have to not be able to perform his Friday sermons? And why would we be deprived of listening to Hazur's Friday sermon? But Hazur showed us that through his actions that we are following the guidance, the instructions of the government. This is not a punishment by God as such. This is something which happens. Science is such which viruses of such sort can come about, and we have to protect ourselves. And this is why Hazur's told us to take these medicines. Otherwise, if it was a punishment, then we wouldn't have taken this. But there's one thing which, for our Ahmadis out there, there's a lot of rumors going around about Ahmadis will be saved, or this is a punishment, and no Ahmadi will be affected. We have to remind ourselves that we're fortunate we have Khalifatul Masih, and whenever we have things like this or we hear such rumors and stories, we should remind people that Hazur has instructed himself that this is not the case, and we shouldn't be thinking like this.
Okay. And another question which is sort of linked to this, it seems that many non-Ahmadi Muslims are classifying those who die from the coronavirus as martyrs. Someone's asking, what is the sort of the Ahmadi viewpoint on this? Is someone who dies from the coronavirus classed as a martyr?
Someone who passes away with, in the time of the Holy Prophet, there was a particular narration. Mustafa can probably find that out now. There was a narration in which the Holy Prophet, that there were a few categories of people that if they pass away, if they die in such a category, then they'll be known as a martyr. They'll be known as a shaheed. The basic one is being killed for your faith, but dying on a particular path for a particular journey or from a particular illness can be known as shaheed as well. But this particular one, I don't think we're in a position to say that someone is a shaheed or not. We're blessed and we're fortunate that we have Khalifatul Masih. If someone does pass away, God forbid, but through this virus, we know people have passed away. Many more will potentially pass away. Ultimately, Hazur can guide us and tell us whether such a person will be categorized as a martyr or not.
Okay, Jazakallah. And Mustafa, I can come to you with the next question. The question is, how does the concept of salvation differ between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism?
Salvation in Christianity and Judaism are very, very different concepts practically, even though they're given the same name in Islam. Sadly, in Christianity and Judaism, I understand that these views do differ. There are loads of denominations and sects within Christianity. Even within Jews, there's some people there's even a disagreement about whether the Day of Judgment exists or not, which is the entire thing about salvation. If there's no Day of Judgment, then there's no question of salvation. That's how much difference there is between Latter-day Saints and Baptist Church, loads of differences. Briefly, Christianity has that whoever accepts Christ will have their sins forgiven. He has taken the burden of their sins, and therefore they immediately and automatically get complete salvation by believing in Christ. What the Jews believe generally, as it says in the Quran, that the Jews say that we are the sons of God and we are his beloved. And Judaism itself is founded on this idea that these are the children of Israel. And that's why they're specifically, their homeland is Israel, because it's the idea of returning back to the land from which they were driven by the Pharaoh. So salvation in those religions is either limited by birth or limited by acceptance of Christ, and that's it, which in itself is not the characteristic or the hallmark of the actions of a loving and merciful God. The Quran itself says, indeed those who believe, those who are Christians, those who are Jews, and those who are Sabians, i.e. those who change their faith, another kind of sect that existed at the time of the Prophet, those of them who believe in Allah and the last day, there will be no fear upon them and nor shall they grieve. So God says the Prophet narrates that God doesn't look at your bodies, he looks at your hearts. And he said in his final sermon, there's no superiority of any race upon any other race except by piety and good action. So Islam does not claim to have a monopoly over salvation like Christians and like Jews do via their own respective beliefs. Salvation is only someone who is... There was the example of a prostitute who spent her entire life steeped in the worst kinds of sin. And once, when getting water out of a well, saw a thirsty dog, and out of sympathy and pity for the dog, she lowered her shoe, took out water and fed and gave water to the thirsty dog. And God revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that the sins of her entire life have been forgiven by that one action of hers. So Islam is the only religion that doesn't restrict God to being some vindictive, some favoritism God, but ultimately a truly loving and merciful God that looks at everybody's situation, look at the fact that people are born with different levels of understanding in different houses, in different backgrounds, and looks that salvation is a matter of the heart and has nothing to do with who you were, where you're born, or what person you do or do not believe in.
Okay, Jazakallah. And coming on to the next question, someone has asked, for babies that are born one day before the Day of Judgment, what will happen to them? And I think, they're asking, will they go to, hell or heaven? What will sort of be the outcome there? If I come to
No difficult one, Tarzan.
Tarzan, you'd like to take this one then?
Babies are born innocent, and if someone is born and passes away, then they will go to heaven. There will be no judgment for them.
Okay. And then there's another two questions that come through that I think are quite linked. One is, how can students stay focused at home when a lot of students still have exams to do, even though university is cancelled and they're working from home. And sort of linked to this as well is, how can students avoid compulsively checking their phones? So how can they avoid distractions at home, and specifically, how can they avoid taking their phone out every 2 seconds?
I think the student can answer this better.
Yeah, Mr. Fazaba will ask you to.
I am that kind of student who, under instructions from Amir al-Mu'mineen, doesn't have my phone 6 days a week. But with the lockdown now, Jamia is different. There's no more lessons. We're now ready for duty, essentially, because London being locked down, people can't come for the protection and the security of but I suppose I'm witness against myself on the weekends and the holidays. I think what I would do, my advice is, this is not Islam, by the way, disclaimer here. Not everything I say is Islam, it's just what I would do. After I get it, checking to see if there's a message there, and then just checking again, just to make sure there isn't a message there. I think what you should do is, for example, when you're tempted towards something, often like sin, for example, like if you see something that's not yours, you want to take it. After you've got whatever you wanted, it tends to be primal, it tends to be instinctive. It often never does sin have any deep meaning behind it. Once you've done that thing, in this case, checking the message, ask yourself what you gained. Unless it was a really, really informative and educational message, which there will be some of, no doubt. If it's just a social or just replying to someone because they message you, if it's compulsive checking, I don't think would obviously be, I think what this means is doesn't mean anything necessarily practically useful, because it wouldn't be compulsive then. Ask yourself, after you've read that message, what did you gain? I'm not asking this to anyone. I have no right to ask anyone. Everyone should ask themselves. Whatever you do, when you incline to do something, when you watch a film, I wouldn't say this as a Murabbi. I wouldn't start banning films. But I ask myself after watching a program sometimes, when I could have done something more useful, what did I actually gain from that? And this is not a Murabbi banning films, or how dare you watch films. But ask yourself, someone who spent their entire life, an entire lockdown, watching Netflix, at the end of the lockdown, what did they actually gain? Not because a Murabbi has said, but in terms of their lives, in terms of their loved ones, in terms of their hobbies, in terms of whatever everyone has something they like doing in life, whether it's loved ones or whether it's a passion or whether it's an interest. Compulsive checking phones, compulsively watching Netflix, all these kind of things to do with social media are ultimately false dawns and hollow things which appear attractive on the surface. So whenever you do these things, I personally try and reflect upon them and ask myself, even if it wasn't religious, if I just lived for my wife because I loved her, does even that source of happiness is not going to be found in Netflix, and nor is it going to be found in your wife, even though your wife tends to be more of a source of contentment than Netflix. Ultimately, it all goes back to God Almighty, because God Almighty is the only being that has genuinely no self-interest, zero self-interest when he tries to help you. Everybody else in the world, no matter who they are, up to your mother, by being human, has some self-interest. And when it says in the Holy Quran, God forbid, may Allah protect us, the day when a man will run away from his wife and his children, a mother will leave her child. That means that ultimately, I think that only refers to those who are sinful. Those who have been good will have no fear in that day. But the Quran says it there, that ultimately there will be mothers who run away from their children. That's not happening now. That will happen at one point. So look for what ultimately has value in life. Look for the messages and everything else. None of them are in your true best interests. And at the end of the day, when it's time to leave the earth, what's going to count for us? It's not going to be those messages, it's not going to be those Netflix. And I'm not saying this as a lecture. I'm saying this because I need to learn this more than anyone else. It's in our own interests to go for what's going to help us and what's going to be there for us when it's time to leave.
Jazakallah. And I'm afraid this next question is going to have to be our last question because we've come quite close to Maghrib time. So Tahir, I'd like to come to you with this question, slightly theological question. In the book Understanding Islam, on page 46, the Holy Prophet the Prophet says the honor will not begin until Isa bin Maryam comes down as a just judge and just ruler. Why did the Holy Prophet ﷺ not generalize the term Imam Mahdi and Messiah instead of specifically mentioning Isa bin Maryam, which confuses a lot of non-Ahmadi Muslims that are waiting for Hazrat Isa alayhi salam to physically come down as a second coming?
It's a very long. It will require a very long answer.
I'm afraid we can ask you for maybe we can post a link to this on our social media.
But just to briefly summarize this, the question, if I may ask again, is why he believes that as Masih Maud has not said why Isa will come down himself. Why is it the Imam Mahdi and Messiah? Is that the question?
The question is, why is the term Isa bin Maryam used specifically instead of using the term instead of using the general term Imam Mahdi or Messiah?
Okay, take it. So Isa bin Maryam, there are many similarities to why this has been used, many reasons why. And if you look in the Holy Quran, Allah the Almighty states that the actual verse is that we've sent down to a prophet to you as we sent to a prophet to Moses. As we sent Moses a prophet, similarly we've sent you as a prophet. So everything which happened to Hazrat Musa ﷺ, being Shari prophet, starting his new dispensation, and 1400 years later, Isa ibn Maryam came to revive the Jews, bring them back onto the path of Judaism. Similarly, that same thing will happen to the Holy Prophet ﷺ. He came with this new Shariat of Islam. 1400 years later, Isa ibn Maryam came back to revive Islam. Why the term Isa ibn Maryam has been used? Because the Holy Prophet ﷺ has said that he will be my Messiah, he will be the Isa, as Isa والسلام, the first Jesus. He came to revive Judaism. Similarly, the same Jesus والسلام, as being as Masih والسلام, will come to revive Islam. But again, like I mentioned, it will require a very long, a very detailed answer. But I believe Mustafa Sahab wants to mention something on this as well.
Just that was essentially the main answer. I just wanted to approach it from a different perspective, which is generally, why are these prophecies not that obvious? Like they're all in some kind of words which don't make it completely obvious. All these questions about faith, why do we believe in someone we don't see, all ultimately come down to the fact that if taking this point to its logical extension, people ask, why can't we see God? Why can't everything just be in front of us? Why? Which is the question, why is there faith? Well, firstly, because if you see God, then people who are blind will want to experience God in other ways. But more than that, there has to be a way for, ultimately, if God was here in front of us, this all comes down to why can't everything just happen in front of our eyes? Because we live in this instantaneous society. The answer is that if God was in front of us, in front of every single person, right there, stopping us when we commit sin, there'd be no more morality. If you knew you were going to get the death penalty for every single tiny sin right now, society would become instantaneously perfect, but then life would become meaningless because there'd be no more choice, there'd be no more good and evil. There has to be a degree of things not being immediately obvious to see who will strive for them. If the negative consequences of sin were that you commit sin, you die tomorrow, no one will commit sin, and that we'd then go to say to God Almighty that, well, I had never chanced. You don't know that I was going to do bad because I didn't even do it. This way, we have the opportunity to do what we do. And that's why things like retribution for our moral actions come later than our actions, to give us a chance to do them, so that we then were given a chance on this earth to actually act as we choose. Otherwise, there'd be no meaning in life if everything was right there, because then we just become robots.
Jazakallah to our panel, Murabbi. I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap it up there. Just like to say that unfortunately some of our viewers have had a few sound issues. This is the first sort of time we are doing this online Ask Murabbi. Inshallah, once we do something like this again, we'll be sure to sort those out. So Jazakallah Tahir Sahab, Jazakallah Mustafa Sahab, and Jazakallah to everyone who's tuned in tonight.
Exactly.